Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT and SAT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your ACT test. A full textbook, tons of ACT questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial at achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today we've got Lewis Newman from Thinking Critically back on the line with us. And Lewis, really happy to have you back. I'd love if you could just introduce yourself for people who haven't heard you before.
Sure. Thanks, Tyler. It's great to be back on your show. I'm Lewis Newman. I am former Dean of Academic Advising and one of the Associate Vice Provosts for Undergraduate Education at Stanford. I was there from 2016 to 2022. And prior to that, I was a faculty member at Carleton College in Minnesota for 33 years, which included a stint as one of the associate deans in the Dean of the College office. And as you mentioned, I am the author of the recently published book, Thinking Critically in College, the Essential Handbook for Student Success. And I work now, actually, now that I'm retired, I work as a college success coach.
Great. Yeah, and I mean, that's what we're going to be talking about today, right? How to be successful in college academically, but also kind of how to make the most of it for yourself, right? When students come to you, kind of how does this present itself, right? Are you kind of these students what like for this topic sort of is it about people who maybe aren't being academically successful in college and how to get there, or is it more about people that are already, they're getting the grades but they want to get more out of their experience?
Yeah, it's really both. So let me focus on both of those because they are two different groups of students. I think for starters, I would want to say that a lot of students, including students who've done very well in a high school, uh, find that when they get to college, the academics are just more challenging than they're accustomed to. And maybe strategies that have worked for them in the past are all of a sudden not working as well, or
Hmm.
even just because the bar is higher and faculty expect students to do more learning on their own. They discover that what would have gotten them an A in high school is getting them a B or a B minus or even a C in college, and that's a shock to their systems. And so, in a certain way,
Right.
that by itself requires some adjustment, some rethinking of what college learning is really all about, and how to do it well. Um, but then, to your second point, there are students who are really doing quite well, who are getting the grade, at least in terms of grade points, grade point average. They're doing fine. They're satisfied with their success in that sense. But they're not necessarily taking advantage of all the opportunities that college offers. And one of the things I like to talk to students about when I work with them is just that there's so many ways in which college can expand your horizons intellectually and
Hmm.
personally, way beyond what classes you take and what grades you get. Many students discover that some of the most important experiences they have in college really never appear on their transcript because they're things that happened outside of their coursework. And students aren't necessarily thinking about how to pursue those opportunities in the best ways. So in both of those cases, I can sometimes coach students to help them reach their goals.
Hmm.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
so
then
then
let's
let's
kind
kind
of
of
go
go
through
through
the
the
first
first
case,
case,
right?
right?
Or
Or
I
I
guess,
guess,
how
how
do
do
you
you
want to
want to
start
start
this
this
off?
off?
Like,
Like,
where do you want to where
where
do
do
you
you
want
want
to
to
begin
begin
here?
here?
I'm happy to begin with just talking about the transition from high school to college academics.
Sure,
Sure,
let's
let's
do
do
that.
that.
Okay. Um, so in many ways, I think students, again, with exceptions for sure, not all high schools are the same, but a lot of high school learning revolves around just absorbing information and knowledge that other people have generated, whether that's through textbooks or things that your teacher tells you. And then you take tests on them and you demonstrate that you've learned what they were teaching you. And then you move on to the next subject. And in that sense, learning has mostly been about absorbing information, not so much about what you do with that information. Um,
Mhm.
Again, with some exceptions. And mostly in college, the shift happens where you're no longer just absorbing the information that other people tell you, you're really being asked to do things with it. So it's
Mhm.
very common on a college test that the questions that show up on that test won't be anything like what you've exactly seen in the past. But
Mhm.
it will require that you have learned what you saw in the past and then can apply it to some new set of information or some new context, and then demonstrate that you know how to see the implications of that information for some new context. And that's something that many students have never had to do before, and they're really
Mhm.
not prepared for it. So that's just one example, but it's indicative of the higher level of thinking that college often asks students to do.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's also just like, it depends a lot on the high school, but I think a lot of high schools don't really ask you to think critically, not trying to plug your book, but that was what came to mind, those words. And you essentially are, you're asked to kind of like be intelligent about sort of what's relevant to what, but you're not asked to maybe like critique as much or have that extra layer of critical thinking. And I also feel like college doesn't necessarily give you any class on how to do that either. It's just kind of like you get there and they're just like, "Hey, this is what you have to do now." There isn't really a bridge for that.
I think that's exactly right. And again, without meaning to particularly plug my book, that was really exactly what motivated me to write it. Namely, that it dawned on me sort of late in my teaching career, to be honest, that as faculty, we generally sort of just assume that students either know how to do these things or they'll just learn them by osmosis as they go through our courses. But
Right.
but we don't actually give them a crash course in, like, here are the basics of the kinds of questions you need to be able to ask, and the ways you need to be able to analyze information.
Mhm.
Again, it occurred to me at some point along the way that when I told students to analyze this text that I was teaching, I taught in the religion department, and we were often reading religious texts and analyzing them and discussing what they meant. I would ask them to analyze something, and they really didn't know what I was asking them to do, because I'd never really spelled it out. And then
Mhm.
it became clear to me that students really need for that to be spelled out. It means putting things in context, or it means um, you know, comparing different interpretations of the same obscure passage and trying to make sense of which interpretation seems most plausible, or something like that. And students just didn't understand what I was asking for. They thought all they needed to do was to try to paraphrase it in their own words, and that was kind of it. And so that's just another example of the kind of thinking that college asks of students all the time. And I think truthfully, when I talk to faculty, I say, we need to be teaching students to do this really much more explicitly than we do.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's there's no point in being mysterious. There's nothing mysterious about it. It's there's no reason why
Right.
Right.
we need to be. It's not a secret, or at least it shouldn't be. And we don't need to have students kind of groping around in the dark looking for what it is that we're asking them to think about. So anyway, that's all by way of saying, absolutely. I think this is a very major piece of the transition from high school to college academically, along with the fact, as I alluded to earlier, that uh, in college, for every hour that you have class, you're probably going to have to spend, again, depending on the subject, 3 to 5 plus hours outside of class doing the reading, doing the assignments. Much more of the work of college is happening outside of class, and it has to be self-motivated in a certain way. And students are often also not prepared for that. And so they
Mhm.
discover that there's really, students get to college, they discover they only take 3 courses at a time, or 4 maybe. When in high school they might have had 6 or 7, and they can't imagine how that could possibly fill up their time. But
Mhm.
sure enough, they discover that actually there's so much more homework and so much more depends on them, that actually they're busier than they ever were in high school with their work.
Right. Yeah, and so that's, I mean, a really interesting point and a transition here, right? I think that, in a way, college, you have a lot more free time in a lot of sense, just in terms of like your class time is no longer 9 a.m. to 3 or 5 p.m. every day, right? Like it's a lot more flexible and oftentimes just like a lower amount of hours in general. But also, like you just mentioned, you're going to get the most value out of like seeking things yourself that are, essentially volunteer, right? To an extent, like maybe you get paid for them, but like you have to go find these opportunities. Um, and so I'd love to maybe talk about kind of what are the ways that students can do that and how, like, what are sort of both like the paths available to students, and then maybe going into each of those different options and talking about kind of like how to pursue them and what the value you're going to get in return is.
Yeah. Well, I'd begin with maybe the most obvious one, which is the faculty of the
Right.
college that you're going to, right? These are people by definition who are experts in whatever it is that they're teaching for the most part.
Mhm.
Parenthetically, I would say occasionally faculty teach classes in areas where they're not exactly experts, but they still know a fair amount more than their students do, to be sure. So, so fundamentally, you're now no longer in high school where your teachers, however smart they are and however well prepared they are, however good they are at teaching, are not likely people who have written articles, published books in the fields that they're teaching you. So now you're faced with the opportunity to really think with and learn from people who have really devoted their lives to studying whatever subject it is that you're taking from them. And that's a great opportunity. It can be very intimidating to a lot of students. This
Right.
person has a PhD in this subject, and I'm just like, this is my very first class in it. I'm feeling a little lost, and this person is a world renowned expert or something. And that can pose its own challenges. We can come back to talking about that later if you'd like. But I think fundamentally the first point is these are people who are great resources for your learning. And
Mhm.
to be able to learn from them, maybe even take the initiative to go beyond what's on the syllabus of the course and go find something that your professor has written. Uh, it doesn't have to be a whole book, it could be an article. It could be a podcast interview that they did or some other thing that they've done that you can find online and go learn something more about what they've studied and what they think about and how they think
Mhm.
about that subject. And then go in and during their office hours and talk to them about it. Um, Faculty love to have students come talk to them about their research. It's a sign that you're interested in their intellectual lives, but it shows the student has initiative and is
Mhm.
willing to reach out and make a connection around the very things that this person has spent their lives studying. So that's the first thing that students can do is really see their faculty members as great resources for their own learning and the opportunity to delve into something much more deeply than maybe they had an opportunity to do in high school. Um, Again, uh, most faculty are going to be very receptive to that. You might occasionally bump into a faculty member who feels like they're too busy with other things and don't have a lot of time to just kind of sit around and shoot the breeze with an undergrad. But
Right.
that's by and large, if they're teaching undergraduate classes, they are likely to at least be interested enough to want to spend a little time with you and hear your questions and how you're understanding the material and ways in which they can be helpful in enhancing your understanding of this subject.
I think it's also just like, why are you in college, right? And I mean, I don't mean that cynically so much as to say that I think if you are a student and you're looking to, say, expand your understanding of biology, just kind of trying to throw out a generic example, um, and you're taking, biology classes from your professor, I mean, realistically, this is most likely the best access you're going to get to like a research professional like this, and the most accessible they will be to you, maybe for the rest of your life. Like once you get into the corporate working world, the professor at a university who, wrote a paper you're interested in doesn't really have time for you. And it's only when you're in their class or in their school that, you kind of have a special in that you can use to potentially not only learn from them or ask questions about things that they've written, but really like be like, can I work with you? Can I help you in some way? Can I build that relationship and also build my knowledge and understanding? When I was in college, I did not really realize that essentially you have like a special ticket when you're in college. And then as soon as you get out of college, you're just another person who works in the corporate world. And the academic people have to focus on their academic world. And that's the one you just left, right?
Exactly. No, I think that's a really good point, Tyler. And I would add to that, um, in addition to the pure learning from these people who are experts, there's also a very, if you will, transactional, practical benefit, which is whatever you do after college, or even while you're in college over the summer or other opportunities that you might have, your faculty can often be enormously helpful in connecting you with those opportunities. You're really fired up about biology, and maybe they're doing some research that they need to hire a student to help them with. Or maybe they know someone who is, or maybe a letter of recommendation from that person sent to someone else at some other institute or organization around the country could get you in the door or get you an interview or even get you an internship or a job. And if you make those connections with faculty, then you have someone to turn to say, "Hey, I'm really interested in pursuing this as a career or whatever, and I want your help. Can you advise me? Could you write me a letter of recommendation?" And faculty do this all the time. And
Mhm.
again, when you're there, seeing them regularly every week in their class, going into their office to talk to them about their work, you have an opportunity to really build a relationship. And then that continues. Beyond that, I'll tell you a story. I was just literally this week in touch with a young man at Stanford. Mind you, at Stanford, I was not on the faculty. I was, as I said, dean of academic advising, which was an administrative position. But I did work with a number of students in various capacities, and one student that I became quite connected to has gone on to do work in the government, actually for the Department of Defense. Very interesting work, and he's all of a sudden changed course. He's decided he wants to go to medical school. And he reached out to me. We've continued to be in touch over these last few years. Reached out to me to say, "Hey, I'd love for you to read my application essay and give me feedback on this." And of course, I was happy to do that because we have a connection, and because we work together, and because we developed that kind of relationship. Having that is good not only while you're in college, but it continues often well after you've graduated. And students ought to be looking for those opportunities to connect with faculty whose interests they share, or who they just feel is a kind of receptive, interested, warm person that they feel they can relate to. And especially at smaller schools, maybe less so at large universities, but at smaller schools like Carleton, where I spent really most of my career, that was very common. Faculty and students often met for lunch or for coffee. Um, Faculty even sometimes had students over to their homes for dinner, or had a class session in their homes, in their living rooms, and so on. So it was very common to have that kind of casual engagement with between faculty and students, and the college encouraged it. And that was precisely because they knew that would really be a huge benefit to the students down the road, and an important part of their educational experience.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Um, And I think also just sort of maybe as we wrap up just like the faculty research angle here, um, I would say that it's important to recognize too that like the kinds of the kinds of projects that you'll have access to are going to be totally different in school than you would ever outside in the working world, right? Especially when you're younger. Um, you don't get the opportunity to work on cool, thoughtful, like research projects most of the time when you get out of college. Usually you are, asked to like update lab records or whatever it is, like whatever is sort of the entry level work for that job that you or career that you've gotten into, right? Because it is, you are entry level at that point. It's your first job. Um, but, to do the like really thoughtful, kind of forward-looking academic analysis, that's another opportunity that you really only get to have in college for most people.
Absolutely. And there's one other piece of this I should add, which is it's not only about helping faculty with their research, especially sort of upper level undergrads, juniors and seniors, often have opportunities to do their own research project under the supervision of a faculty member who guides them, who meets with them periodically, and helps them think through their research and pursue it. And maybe even in some cases get it published. There are student research journals and sometimes even regular research journals that accept student work. So you have an opportunity to really do independent and original research of your own, and then have this faculty member uh, really give you the kind of guidance and support to make that experience even more impactful. And uh, research has shown, in fact, that doing that sort of project under the supervision of a faculty member can be one of the kind of premier experiences of your college career. And even if you don't pursue that research after college, the skills that you learn in the process of doing it can be enormously valuable.
Right. And that kind of project also can be the kind of thing that looks really good on your resume and gives you really good stories to talk about with interviewers and things like that.
Absolutely. It shows initiative, it shows your ability to think creatively, it shows your ability to dig through an archive or through sets of data or something else and solve a problem or answer a question that maybe nobody had looked at in that particular way before, and so forth. There are lots of ways in which you can kind of parlay that into a great resource, a great asset, really, when you're interviewing for some kind of position. And so I think absolutely it looks great on a resume.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's great. Well, and so then the next thing, or I mean, anything else on kind of working with faculty? Otherwise, I think we could go to the sort of the next thing you can do to
Well,
make
yeah,
the
sure.
most of your college experience.
Just a quick footnote, since I kind of alluded to it earlier.
Yeah.
A lot of times in my experience, students are reluctant to go to faculty because they just feel intimidated. They feel a little bit of what we call imposter syndrome. I don't belong here. Everybody else is smarter than I am. This person for sure is way smarter than I am. Look at how educated they are. This is a common experience. It's a particularly common experience, I would add, for first generation students, but
Mhm.
but really for all students. And I would, as I do in my book, I would encourage students to do their best to push through that resistance and reluctance to reach out to faculty. And almost always they will discover that it was worth it was worth the effort. But it's hard. It's hard to go into a faculty member's office and say, I feel really lost in your course, or I just didn't understand what we were talking about, in class the other day, or whatever it might be, and sort of expose yourself, and try to really ask for the help that you need. This is asking for help is a really important skill in college and in life, and asking
Mhm.
for help from your professors is a particularly valuable thing to do. Yeah, even when
Right.
it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's also, frankly, if you can't do it now, how are you going to do it later? And when you need help from your boss to explain something or whatever.
Absolutely.
So, we you also when we were talking about this ahead of the call, you had a couple other like really interesting things that are other ways to kind of get the most out of your academic experience. And one of those was off-campus study. And so I actually am guilty of not ever doing that in college. So I'd love if you could kind of walk us through kind of what it is and like essentially how to pursue it and how to make it kind of relevant.
Sure. I will confess I didn't do it when I was in college either, although I did in graduate school. I did go overseas to study a part of that time. So, what I would say is, again, studies have demonstrated that uh, these experiences of being away, especially in another country, in a different culture, can be enormously impactful. They open our perspective and horizons. They show us what it's like to live with in different circumstances, to try to make sense of another place and its customs and its language. And
So this is like study abroad programs. Is it kind of what that means?
yes, what I'm thinking about is
Okay.
study abroad programs. There are also off-campus programs, of course, that are domestic.
Mhm.
Stanford had a program called Stanford in New York, where students went from
Right.
California and spent a quarter in New York. But and there are other such programs, of course, and they can also be extraordinarily valuable just because you get opportunities to see other parts of the country and do other kinds of things. But I'm focused on at this point on study abroad programs, precisely because the world is increasingly, as we say, a global village, and we are
Mhm.
very deeply interconnected. And knowing something about another country and another culture uh, can often be very, very beneficial. If you're working in the
Mhm.
business world, you're going to encounter people from other cultures and other countries. And if you've been in another country and tried to make sense of navigating another culture, you will be ahead in your interactions with that colleague because you'll have some basis for asking them questions and for understanding that their assumptions about certain things might be very different from yours. And you won't dismiss that out of hand because you've now discovered that there are a lot of different ways of living and a lot of different ways of constructing societies and families and so on. And all of a sudden you discover that actually it's enormously mind expanding to spend time in another part of the world. Particularly, again, you can go to England where people speak the same language, England or Australia or Ireland or other places where English is the spoken language. Or you can go to a
Mhm.
place where you really are going to be forced to use another language that you're still learning, and even if the instruction is going to be in English, you'll be surrounded by people who are speaking a different language, and that forces you out of your comfort zone in a certain way, and that has been for many people some of the most powerful one of the most powerful experiences of their college careers. I can tell you, I twice
Right.
led overseas programs, short programs, 2-week programs, as it happens, with a colleague, um, and it was some of the best teaching I ever did. And students who were on those programs insisted it was one of the best courses they ever took, because again,
Mhm.
they were learning about things and then going out and seeing them right there at their doorstep.
Mhm.
It was wonderfully uh, instructive and exciting and fun, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, my wife did study abroad in Florence her senior year of college and like it like changed her life, right? Like gave her like a love of cooking, like a love of Italian food, like all kinds of different things happened from that. It was like by far the defining part of her college experience for her. And I think also, depending on what you're trying to do with that, right? Like, yeah, you can kind of use it as like a trip, but also there are definitely programs where that like what you're doing is very relevant to your career and very relevant to like the type of work you want to be doing or the industry that you're in and can make a big impact on your resume and a bunch of other things.
Absolutely. Both of my sons actually did off-campus programs through something called SIT. which is one of the international organizations that runs such programs. Uh, one of them in Morocco and one of them in South Africa. And they would say, too, that it was among the most formative experiences of their college careers.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Some schools, by the way, run their own programs, as Stanford
Mhm.
did, and have their own staff and faculty in centers in various places around the world. And you can go on a program that's really all students from your school who are together. Uh,
Mhm.
and one of the benefits is that you are typically in a much smaller circle and you get to know those other students really well when you're on an off-campus program, much better than you probably get to know the students in a course on campus. And that
Yeah.
too is one of the benefits. Uh, but whether your school runs its own programs or whether you go through an organization like SIT or others, you will undoubtedly find that it is really a life-changing experience.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, that's great. And then any other things on doing, essentially study abroad before we move on to the next thing?
No, I think that probably covers it pretty much.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, as I said, I'll just underscore this point. A big piece of what I think makes this so powerful is that it often forces students out of their comfort zone and it forces them to question things that they always assumed were just universally true. And they discover that, well, I guess they're not universally true because that's not the way people think here, or that's not the way people interact in this situation, in this culture. And that by itself gets you thinking outside of the box that you've often grown up in. And that's really the key benefit, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Great. And so then I also, another thing that I was not familiar with that was on your list, was service learning. And what is service learning, and why is it an enriching activity to consider as well?
Sure. Service learning is a broad term that covers uh, learning that happens in a course, but in service to some group or someone outside of the course. So classic examples
Mhm.
include uh, you're taking a course on statistics. And one of the projects for that course involves partnering with some community organization, maybe a nonprofit, uh, and doing some work for them as a volunteer that will force you to use what you're learning about statistics in order to help this organization do some kind of analysis that's going to be beneficial to them. So it's
Mhm.
basically applied learning. It's applying what you're learning in class outside of class in partnership with some other group or organization. It's often nonprofits. It can sometimes be government organizations.
Mhm.
Uh, so I'm thinking, for example, of other projects that I was familiar with from my time at Carleton, where I actually oversaw the office that did service learning. And that included students who were studying Spanish, who then went out into
Mhm.
the community and did um, sort of oral histories of Spanish speaking immigrants in the community for a communal organization. And things of that nature. So, again, what studies have shown is that students who are forced to use what they're learning in some real world context like that just learn the material much better. They're excited about it. They're engaged with it because they know somebody's counting on them to be able to use this in a way that's going to be really important for them. So it sort of ups the stakes in a way for your learning, and
Right.
and people are enormously appreciative, and then they discover that what they're learning in school really has applications out there in the world, and there are people who are really eager to hire them in effect to do this work that they've just learned how to do in these classes. So most schools these days have at least some courses. Some schools have
Mhm.
many courses that have a service learning component in them, and they're complicated to set up. I can tell you that it's that you have to develop relationships with community organizations, and that can be very time consuming. But for the student
Mhm.
who simply sort of comes to the course and then
Plotting in, yeah.
yeah just plugs into a system or structure that's already been set up by the faculty member, it is a wonderful opportunity to both learn more deeply and also to be of help to people out there in the world.
Mhm.
And that's really, again, can be a tremendously transformative experience for students.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that it's also a great way to kind of start to bridge that gap between what you're doing in school and what you're doing in the real world, because like we talked about a little bit earlier, like what you do in the real world is often a lot more, for lack of a better word, boring, but also like has real purpose, right? And that is something that I feel like is important to give you the context of, why what you're learning matters or how you're going to use it in the world after college.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, learning for its own sake is a great thing. I'm all in
Mhm.
favor of people who want to learn something about Chinese poetry, not because they're ever going to use it in their lives in the world, but just because they're curious about it and because it's beautiful and they learn something about Chinese culture and they learn something about poetry. And it's a great, it's a great opportunity, which you pretty much only have in college to just sort of take something, if you will, kind of just for the hell of it, just because it's interesting and
Right.
get credit for it, right? But it's also wonderful when you can take something in college that really does have real world applications and gives you an opportunity to see a little bit of the real world. I say that quote unquote, right? The world outside of the college bubble, and
Mhm.
really come to understand just how important the skills you're learning in college can be to the
Mhm.
world.
Exactly. And then the last thing on our, at least on the little list that I have, definitely feel free to add more if we're missing anything. But is like conferences, seminars, things like that, right? And so talk to me a little bit about, because conferences, at least for me, I didn't even think about until I got out of college and was going to them to be a salesperson, right? 22-year-old or 23-year-old kid. Um, and so I just never, it never like occurred to me um, in college that I should be looking to go to conferences related to my field, though, of course, from a third party perspective now, that makes a lot of sense. And so I guess what are kind of like the things that you would be looking to have people do or recommending that they do? Like what types of events, are relevant? Like what are the sort of things that you want to be looking for in terms of like the content of the events and things like that? And then just any other tips related to that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, conferences is maybe a limited opportunity for most undergraduates. I'll admit that.
Right.
Because mostly they're designed by and for faculty, to be honest,
Hmm.
or other college professionals. So there are probably somewhat limited opportunities for students to get involved. But I will say this: it's related to conferences. It's sort of special events which happen on campus. I like to tell students all the time that over and above whatever courses the college offers, you want to keep your eye out for all the other programs and events, guest speakers, lecturers, conferences that are happening on the campus that are bringing together experts on a certain subject for a day of discussion or a panel or a special film showing or theater production
Hmm.
or musical production or whatever. There are all these opportunities to learn things and be exposed to things way beyond anything you'll likely ever take a class in. And
Well, and also probably beyond, probably with a lot wider breadth or like with a lot more options than you'll really see in the real world, right? Like I used to think it was fun to like do improv or things like that. And, now if I want to do it, I have to go to like a 25 to $45 class versus in college, they had that club doing it for free. Like I could have done it back then. So that's just one example.
exactly, that's a great example. And there are so many others like that. And I think students often don't focus on that stuff when they're in school, maybe because they're just focused on their courses and their grades. And of course, there's nothing wrong with working hard on your courses and working to get good grades. But don't overlook all the educational opportunities that are just at your doorstep. You will never again,
Mhm.
I think it's fair to say, outside of a college or university environment, you will never again be in a place where all these opportunities to learn and engage and just discover other worlds of ideas and cultural productions where those things will just be at your doorstep and available by and large for free. And
Mhm.
so in that sense, I think actually this being an election year, there'll be a lot of campuses where political candidates will be speaking because they often like to
Mhm.
go to college campuses. And that's an opportunity too to get engaged in the world of politics and to hear what these candidates have to say and ask them questions face to face. So there are just all sorts of opportunities like that I always encourage students to take advantage of. The other piece I will add, and this is back to courses really, but many colleges and universities offer small discussion-based seminars for especially for
Mhm.
first year students because it's often a great way to kind of introduce students to the life of the college and the kind of academic work that college involves. So many colleges have these as requirements. You have to take a required first year seminar. Often there are choices of different topics you can select from, but whatever the system is at your college, if there are first year seminars, they're almost always worth taking because you are in a relatively smaller group. Then it's not a huge lecture class. It's going to be a small discussion based class likely. You'll likely have much more access to the faculty member teaching it because it's a small class, and you'll have much more engagement with your fellow students, all of whom, like you, are just beginning their college careers, and so you're all in the same place. Other courses you take in your career may be a mix of first, second, third, and fourth year students, maybe even graduate students in some cases. So, it's a very special environment for learning. And
Mhm.
again, studies have shown that students who take first year seminars are often very engaged. They're very excited about their learning. They kind of get into college much more quickly when they do that. So I always encourage students, even if it's not required by your college, to look for those opportunities for small, intimate first year seminar courses.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, also, frankly, it's just like you never know what you could find, right? Like you might realize that you actually really want to do something else, or that you might want to have a different direction within your field. I mean, my own personal example of this is that my senior year, I took an advanced statistics course just kind of to do it, and I ended up really enjoying it. I got an A. I really got along well with the professor, and he was like, "You've never taken any statistics courses before?" I was like, "No." He's like, "Well, you're really good at it." And I was like, "Well, too bad I'm going into marketing and sales," right? Like, and yeah, like marketing has a lot of data analytics and stuff, but I didn't even end up going down that road in my career. I've ended up being more kind of on the people side than the numbers side of marketing. Um, but like maybe if I had figured that out sophomore year, right, I would have ended up in a much more like data oriented direction, and it could have changed like the whole course of my life, basically. And so I think it's just important to kind of like use college is one, kind of the most freedom and free time that you'll have for most people for the rest of your life. Like that's not meant to be depressing. It's just that like you don't typically get to like go to your employer and be like, "Hey, I really want to like work on like I want to like learn design and like spend like 3 months like doing like a little design program with like one of the UX designers here." And they'll be like, no, please go back to making cold calls." Um, right? But the second thing too is that like it's all available to you and it's all already paid for, right? You go look at how much a coding boot camp costs, right? You could go take that class for not free because technically you're paying for credit hours, but you kind of prepaid for those hours, so you could use that. Um, and yeah, like I think that my what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is that like a lot of those opportunities are somewhat consistent with how high school was, and so you don't really realize that after college it just kind of ends. And you have to like spend 9 to 5 every day doing like a single thing with much less freedom to explore.
Yep, absolutely. I'll tell you a funny anecdote here, pertinent to this. I taught a couple of times actually in my career at Carleton. I taught a first year seminar that I called. Remember, again, I was in the religion department. Called "Faith, Hope, and Love: Religious Responses to Suffering." And it was a
Mhm.
great class. I loved teaching it. One of the students in one of those seminars went on to become a minister, uh, and just recently was hired as the new chaplain at Carleton. So he's back at Carleton now as the college chaplain, having been there as an undergrad. And I
Mhm.
can't say that that course is what set him on a career to become a minister. I don't know that it is. He might have anyway, or he might have taken some other courses that led him in that direction. But I'm fairly certain that that course had an impact on the students who took it. It opened their eyes to ways of thinking about human suffering, which is a common experience, right? And ways in which religion addresses human suffering. And we
Mhm.
used examples from, all sorts of different religions and different religious figures. And that's one tiny example of the ways in which just one course where you're reading things carefully and talking about them with a small group of other students can really be eye-opening and maybe even life-changing, and certainly gives you an opportunity to, as you were just saying, Tyler, like learn about something that you might never use in your professional life, but nonetheless ends up becoming important in other ways.
Yeah, exactly. Do you have any other things you want to talk about today? Anything we haven't covered yet?
Yeah, I think there's one other main thing I'd like to cover, which is that and I talked about it a bit earlier, but to say a little more about this transition from high school level to college level learning. Um,
Sure.
because one of the things that I think one of the great opportunities, let me put it that way, in college that a lot of students don't take advantage of is the opportunity to really learn how to learn better, learn how to learn more
Mhm.
effectively, uh, really to sort of supercharge your learning process. And the way you do that, there are many ways to do that. Some of it is about studying the way a person studies, and there are many research projects that have demonstrated that there are more and less effective ways of studying if you simply want to try to remember the material. And cramming is definitely one of the least effective ways of studying, which is the way that a lot of students do it, because they think that somehow that's going to be more, well, it's maybe more efficient or whatever, but it actually doesn't produce long-term learning as well as other methods. And apart from even just the way we study, there's a kind of self-awareness and self-consciousness about the learning process itself. So I like to recommend to students that they should imagine every term, in addition to the courses they're actually signed up for, they should they should imagine that there's kind of a shadow course or an imaginary course that they're taking. It's called learning how to learn. And they're not going to get a grade in that class because it isn't a real class. It's just in their heads, right? But they can, if they want, set up for themselves at the beginning of the quarter or the semester. Like, here are my goals for what I want to do to learn better. Maybe reading more effectively, or studying, improving my study skills, or, becoming more aware of like how I make connections between one subject and another, or the things that I learned in one part of the course to the next part. Really focusing on how all of those puzzle pieces fit together. Whatever your particular goal is, articulate it, put it in a Word doc somewhere or in a notebook somewhere. And then every so often, once a week, once every couple of weeks, check in with yourself and make a couple of notes about how am I doing? How am I progressing? Am I making progress? Is there evidence that I'm actually getting better at this? It might be writing, it might be any other part of your learning that you're focused on improving. And as you focus on it more explicitly, you really have an opportunity to pay close attention to how you're learning and why you're learning and how that learning is becoming more impactful and more important to you. And when we track that for ourselves and then kind of even give ourselves an imaginary grade at the end of the term, right? We have the opportunity to really notice how we're learning. I like to say to students all the time, at the end of your college career, you want to have a diploma for sure. You want to have a degree. You put a lot of time and money into this. You want to cross the finish line. But the purpose of your education is not to cross the finish line and get the diploma.
Right.
The purpose of your education is to become educated and to learn skills that you'll be able to use out there in the world, back to service learning, for example, or even just learning how to solve a problem. I'm faced with a problem. I need to figure out what sort of data do I need to solve that problem? How do I need to think about it? What other experts do I need to refer to help me make sense of this problem, etc. Right? Those are all skills you can practice in college. And if you're focused on practicing those skills and improving at them, by the time you get to the end of the 4 years, you will have something that you can take with you that you'll use and remember long after most of the actual material that you studied is forgotten or even outdated. And that's really the value. The value of college is the kind of learning that you discover you can do and becoming even better at it. And again, that requires a change of orientation, because most students go in with a sense of it's like it's like college is
Like a
it's like a
checklist.
checklist. Exactly. I've got to accumulate X number of credits. I've got to maintain a GPA at least of this level. I've got to do the following required courses, and if I clear all of those hurdles or check off all those boxes, I'll get my degree and I'll be out of here. And this requires that you think about your learning in a very much deeper and more self-reflective way. And that's a change that most students aren't prepared for. And frankly, I think most students don't really ever do. And to that extent, I think they cheat themselves out of one of the greatest benefits that college has to offer them. So that's maybe in the grand scheme of things, the most significant thing that I think students can do to get the most out of college, uh, in a way that will really serve them well for the rest of their lives.
Thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Lewis Newman with the book Thinking Critically in College, the Essential Handbook for Student Success. And you can have a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout.